Hi, Chag Sameach. This is Jerry Isaac-Shapiro. Thank you for being with all of us today. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt, how undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you on the march, and when you were famished and weary, cut down all the stragglers in your rear. So therefore, when the Lord your God grants you safety from all of your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, timche et zecher Amalek mitachat hashamayim lo tishkach. You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. So the mitzvah to wipe out the memory of Amalek is one of the more troubling mitzvot of the Torah. How can the same Torah that says all people are created in the image of God command us to wipe out an entire nation from earth? And how can the same God who admonished the angels not to rejoice at the drowning of his children at the Sea of Reeds tell our ancestors to destroy all the men and the women and the children of this one tribe? So while we explore this question, how can a supposedly all-compassionate God command us to inflict such seeming brutality, I'd like to see if the concept of Amalek still resonates with us today. Is there an Amalek out there? And if so, are we still commanded to blot out its memory, to wipe it or them out of existence? So let's start with a simpler question. Is the mitzvah to erase Amalek, or is it to erase the memory of Amalek? Our ancestors were not commanded to wipe out their own recollection of Amalek. They were actually commanded to remember forever what Amalek did. It's interesting, and not a coincidence, that this insistence on remembering Amalek is joined at the hip with the insistence on remembering our ancestors' journey from Egypt, which we memorialize in the Seder. We even call our Pesach book a Haggadah to remind us that we're to retell the story. The root comes from lahagid, to tell. In that light, the mitzvah regarding Amalek is twinned with the mitzvah of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt. The Torah tells us, and our tradition insists, that we keep our tribal memories intact, that we retell them to the next, and the next generation, even when those memories are painful. As much as I usually steer clear of Shoah references, one comes to mind in this context. Too many lately have asked, so why do we continue to tell the stories of the Shoah, of a tragedy that happened decades and decades ago? Because we are actually hardwired to do this. Since Sinai and our development as a people and a soon-to-be nation, we tell our stories, even when we're on the short end of the stick. We're called the people of the book, and I've amended that quite often when I teach. Some of you, no doubt, have heard me say this, to say that we're actually the people of the history book. And history is, among other things, about the importance of memory and recollection. And speaking of history, we need a bit now just to at least set the scene about Amalek's origins. Because while Amalek is a concept and not just an actual physical enemy, Amalek was also an actual physical enemy before it or they became something larger. According to the Torah, Amalek was the first enemy that Israel encountered after the crossing of the Sea of Reeds. The Amalekites attacked the Israelites in a battle at Rephidim, near Horeb, near the northern part of Sinai. In the book of Shemot, Joshua was inspired and encouraged by Moshe, and he fought against Amalek. Amalek wasn't completely destroyed, but the battle was won by the Israelites. So in commemoration of the victory, Moshe built an altar and proclaimed that God will be at war against Amalek throughout all time, which implies that Israel is commanded to wage a holy war of extermination against Amalek for all time. The inference is because in the Torah, the wars of Israel were synonymous with the wars of the Lord. While the Torah's accounts are not usually backed up by actual physical evidence, the period of the judges and the monarchy do lend tangible and credible corroboration to the narrative. During the periods of the judges, the Amalekites participated with other nations in the attack on the Israelite tribes. Together with the Ammonites, they joined Moab against Israel, and were among those who captured the city of Palms, which was apparently a reference to Jericho. The Amalekites and the people of the east joined the Midianite raids on the Israelites in the time of Gideon. And like true desert people, they probably took part in the destruction of crops, and that's related in the book of Judges. The decisive battle between Israel and Amalek came only with the advent of the monarchy in the very famous Amalekite War of Shaul, our first king. According to the biblical account, the war began as a result of a divine command of the Lord to Saul through Samuel to smite Amalek and destroy it, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass, entirely, thoroughly. Saul's act of extermination was actually not absolute. He spared the best of the sheep and the cattle, setting aside a part for sacrifice to God, and he spared Agag, the king of Amalek. From the brief information in Samuel, it may be concluded that Saul achieved victory over the Amalekites and advanced all the way to their headquarters, the city of Amalek. We know that the Amalekites were not completely destroyed by Saul, since at the end of his reign, they were still raiding the Negev. After the victories of Saul and David, his successor, the Amalekites ceased to be a factor of any influence in the border regions of Judah and the Negev. So let's turn back to the question, is there an Amalek today, or worse, are there multiple Amaleks today? According to the Talmud, King Sennacherib, who was the king of Assyria, known for his military campaigns against Babylonia and Judah, he mixed up the nations. The rabbis during the time of the Talmud taught that the nations of the world had intermingled so much that it was impossible to tell who was who and who was not an Amalekite. And because of that, the mitzvah of wiping out Amalek was effectively nullified. Okay, so if you've made the connection, this also means that Amalek has gotten mixed into every other nation, which also means that a little bit of Amalek is in everyone. Here's another question. We have had plenty of enemies, unfortunately. So why Amalek is so special? Why is their punishment so severe? Here's one interpretation. Our ancestors were commanded to remember what Amalek did to them, and the text specifically says he, Amalek, surprised you on the march from Egypt. So the commentary says the Israelites were confident and enthusiastic when they left Egypt. The real sin of Amalek was that they robbed these proto-Jews of their idealism and instilled fear into them. Frankly, I'm not so sure. This commentary doesn't win me over. The Israelites were already fearful and mistrusting of their leaders, and it would really be a stretch to call them idealistic. Another possible reason why Chazal, our sages, saw Amalek as different than our other enemies. There's a verse right before the admonition about Amalek, the commandment to have honest weights and measures, because anyone who deals dishonestly is abhorrent to the Lord your God. This also serves to warn us that when people cheat each other, the national bonds of unity and trust are strained, and the nation becomes vulnerable to Amalek. In other words, we ourselves are at least partially culpable for the dangers met out to our own people. So I don't think that this is blaming the victim. Rather, it's a reminder that we are stronger even and particularly against enemies like Amalek than when we're united, when we watch out for each other. That's a positive spin, I grant you. We are stronger together. My somewhat less charitable question is, why were the stragglers allowed, quote-unquote stragglers, allowed to walk behind the stronger ones at the front of the line? Why were the old and the infirm at the end of the line screaming their weakness to the desert enemies? Why weren't the leaders keeping an eye on the people who most needed to keep an eye on them? Were they just walking, schmoozing with the cool tribal leaders, the more popular, the more important tribal leaders? If the Exodus, if there actually was a historical Exodus, happened around the 13th century, before the Common Era, the Israelites' descendants wrote in the Talmud about 1,800 years later, Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Bazeh, that all Jews are responsible for one another. Part of our examination about Amalek, what Amalek did to us, has to at least consider how we let it happen. So back to the question. Why was there such a harsh punishment when none of our other ancient enemies, and there were plenty, warranted such a sentence? Nachmanides, 13th century, said such severe measures were justified because Amalek's attack against Israel was actually an attack against God. Had the war been simply political, Nachmanides says, God would not have commanded Israel to blot out the nation completely because Amalek was motivated by a desire to prove their superiority over God. They deserve such punishment. Nachmanides saw the mitzvah of destroying Amalek as a challenge to Israel. He explained that the mitzvah could only be carried out from a sense of protecting God's honor and following God's commandments, not out of revenge. He also said that only a person of prodigious merit would be able to sustain such a test. Maimonides, more or less living at the same time as Nachmanides, said that the commandment to wipe out Amalek only applied when Amalek refused to make peace with Israel. The inference is that it's not the nationality that's a problem, but rather the warmongering spirit of Amalek. So here's a question. If we can't locate any modern Amalekites, can we continue to honor the commandment? A rabbi, a contemporary rabbi who now lives in Israel, Rabbi Odes, said there are characteristics and underlying values that Amalek exemplified, attacking the weak and attacking the defenseless. So it's plausible to mark these nations which follow such negative role modeling as modern-day Amalekites. I would posit that this is a dangerous path and that we would have to ever so carefully make our case that such and such nation deserve the punishment reserved for only one nation ever. Again, an example from World War II is valid, though it's far from perfect. Nazi Germany certainly attacked the infirm and the helpless and the weak, a sure sign of its Amalekiteness. Yet, did the righteous Gentiles and those few who did stand up, albeit too few, and the children, did they also merit that kind of destruction? Rabbi Yehuda Amital, a former Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Zion, said that the problem with Amalek was that it had an ideology of complete randomness. He cites a passage in Dvarim, in quote-unquote Deuteronomy, where it says that Amalek karcha b'derech, that they happened upon the people of Israel, that they just happened upon the people of Israel. This implies that the attack was random. Whoever Amalek ran into, it attacked, regardless of any political or racial or religious rationale. According to this rabbi, Rabbi Amital, Jews can blot out Amalek by living purposefully, the opposite of randomness, by living with an objective and direction and values. According to the Sfat Emet, what a good friend of mine calls the Sfas Emes, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter in the mid-19th century in Poland, the essence of the commandment to zachor, to remember, requires each of us to first maintain an active inner awareness of what Amalek did to our ancestors. And second, even during times when we feel no external threat, we must recognize and conquer the Amalek within ourselves. The gematria, I know many of you are fans of gematria, the gematria for Amalek is the same as for safek, for doubt. When Amalek attacks us, we're attacked by doubt. Doubt of our own abilities, doubt of the righteousness of our cause, maybe even doubt in our own belief in the existence of God. Just as with the stragglers in the desert, Amalek exploits our own vulnerabilities against us. The origin of Amalek's hatred of Jews actually begins at the very beginning of the Torah. In Breshit, we're introduced to Amalek the person, before he became the leader of a clan, before that clan became a nation of the same name. It said, now Timnah was a concubine to Eliphaz, the son of Esau, and she bore Amalek to Eliphaz. Amalek, if you follow that genealogy, was Esau's grandson. The rabbis tell us that Amalek was raised in the tents of Esau, constantly hearing his grandfather bemoan his fate and how Esau's brother, Jacob, had stolen his birthright. Amalek absorbed Esau's hatred of the children of Jacob, which then became part of the character of the nation named for him. A conversation about Amalek would not be complete without at least a reference to Haman. We all know that Haman, is understood to be a descendant of Agag, the king of Amalek. Haman is quite aware of the Jews' victories over Amalek, both in the desert and in the time of King Saul. His desire to wipe out the Jews as a nation was a direct result of how he viewed his nation's defeat at the hands of the Israelites. I mentioned that the rabbi saw an aspect of Amalek's sin as being founded in randomness, no plan, no thought behind his behavior. This connects to one element in the Purim narrative. It actually connects to the name Purim itself. Purim comes from pur, lots. Haman cast lots to determine the date on which the Jews were to be wiped out. Pure chance, pure randomness. So we're still left with the nagging question, does Amalek exist today? And if so, who or what is it? I found rabbis in preparing for this and others in Israel who insist that Palestinians are Amalek, striving to kill not just the state of Israel, but the Jewish people. Some say it's Iran. There are others who have declared social phenomena as the 21st century embodiment of Amalek. Some insert liberalism here. Some say atheism. Some say apathy. There are even a few who say Zionism. I'm partial to the ones who steer clear of specific peoples. To say all of Iran or all Palestinians are Amalek is a not so subtle Jewish code that says we're obligated to blot out those nations. In this moment, when we are all affected by an unseen enemy, it seems appropriate to understand the message that lies directly in front of us. Just as a virus is contagious, so too is hatred and fear. Just as an illness can be contained and eventually eradicated only by all of us working together, the only way to defeat evil is to band together, to unify, in spite of what used to seem like significant differences. A virulent strain of virus demands our vigilance, and so does Amalek. Thank you.